What's up, everybody? My name is Dimitri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this week's episode is Ian Bremmer. Ian is the president and founder of Eurasia Group, the world's leading global research and consulting firm. He's also the author of more than 10 books, including his latest, The Power of Crisis, in which he argues that we are unprepared for a trio of looming crises in the areas of pandemic response, climate change, and the next technological revolution. All of these looming crises that Ian focuses on are subjects that we've explored in great depth over the years, with folks like former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, NASA's Chief Climate Scientist Gavin Schmidt, Google's Eric Schmidt, and so many more. You can find all of those previous and relevant conversations in the related section of this week's episode page on our website at hiddenforces.io. Because of the ongoing war in Ukraine and its effect on global commodity markets, and in particular, oil and gas, our conversation today leads with a discussion about climate policy, what the war in Ukraine perhaps reveals about our vulnerabilities as we try and transition towards more sustainable, carbon-free forms of energy production, and how to balance our national security concerns while at the same time ensuring that we can meet the long-term climate goals set out in the 2016 Paris Agreement. In the second part of our conversation, we continue our discussion about energy markets, but the discussion quickly pivots to a much broader conversation about the upcoming elections in 2022 and 2024, and specifically why there seems to be a persistent leadership deficit in American politics today, and what we can do to change that. We also discuss media reform and what we can do as individuals, and in some cases as influencers with large followings, to have more constructive and good faith conversations around the issues that matter to all of us as we try and navigate what I think is the most dangerous time for the international system since at least the early stages of the Cold War. My goal with this episode, among other things, is to bring you the perspective of someone who operates within some of the most powerful networks of people in the world and is an advisor to many of them. His years of experience speaking with global leaders, CEOs of Fortune 100 companies, and experts across all industries and territories makes Ian an invaluable resource for anyone trying to think about the future path of policy, risks to global governance, and so much more. As most of you already know, Hidden Forces is listener supported. I don't rely on advertisers or commercial sponsors. So the second part of today's conversation with Ian is available to premium subscribers only. You can access that part of the conversation, as well as the transcripts and intelligence reports to each episode by visiting our website at hiddenforces.io, selecting the episode that you're interested in, and clicking on the premium extras, where you can then sign up to one of our premium content tiers. And with that, please enjoy this week's highly informative and timely episode with my guest, Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Dimitri, happy to join you.
It's great having you on. Great seeing you again. Just to wrap this up, because I wanted to start as quickly as possible so that we took full advantage of your time. But you and I last met for the first time, and that was the last time as well, some years ago before the pandemic at a gym in New York City. I recognized you as Ian Bremmer. It was a really funny moment for me, and honestly, a really great moment. And I get to have these moments sometimes, rarely though, at this stage in my life. A lot more earlier, especially when I started getting to radio or podcasting or TV, when I would meet people whose work I was familiar with or studied as a college student or shortly after. And I can't quite pin down when it was when I first began to read your work, and I think it must have been in the national interest, but I definitely used to watch you, Dimitri Sims, Anatol Lievin, and folks like that at the Nixon Center. And in anticipation of this interview, I went back to C-SPAN. And I saw one of those where they had a new cover. I think it was Uncle Sam pointing at the reader. And one, besides the fact that it's crazy, because at the time I thought that you would have been like 26 years old. And I went back and I realized that you had already started Eurasia Group back in 1998, which I found astounding. But it made me, I don't want to say it was nostalgia. There was a nostalgia for sure. And I'm happy to talk about that in this conversation. But it brought me back to that period of time, that period between 2006 and 2008, where the war in Iraq had not gone as expected. And there was a sense that we needed to make the best of the situation, transition, and sort of figure out who we wanted to be as Americans, what we wanted the mission to be, et cetera. And it made me also think about how the last 20 years have felt kind of like we spent a bunch of it going downhill, then we spent a bunch of it going uphill, and we're kind of back to where we started, it feels like. I don't necessarily want to start the conversation like that. I just wanted to kind of bring it up because I want to talk about your book. I want to talk about who you are, and maybe we'll have a chance to discuss all of that. And feel free to comment on it, but tell us a little bit about who you are, what Eurasia Group is, and what led you to founding a risk consultancy group.
Well, those days in the early aughts, it was a time that the United States was unsure of itself. And, we had come off of defeating the Soviets in the Cold War and defeating them in a way that was particularly self-empowering because our ideology won, our ideas won, our values won. Like literally, we had a better system. And that really kind of makes you feel like, yeah, that's right. I'm American. And, when I started my company back in 1998, it was this time that felt like the world not was our oyster, but was full of possibility and opportunity. Emerging markets were emerging and they were becoming more developed, which meant more like us over time. And maybe even the Russians, maybe even, right? We saw the colored revolutions in the former Soviet states that they wanted more of our system. They wanted the political liberties. And we knew that we had our own problems and our hypocrisies, and we didn't always live up to our standards. But we also knew that when the chips were down and you had a choice between the Americans and the Soviets, everyone out there knew where they wanted to be, who they wanted to bet on. And I started my company kind of in that time of possibility. Keep in mind, I was very, very young when I went to college at 15, when I got my PhD at 24. I'd been pushed ahead a couple times when I was quite young in grammar school. And for me, political science was not, I was going to be an academic. It was more, I found the topic fascinating and I wasn't really ready for a real job. But once I got my PhD, I'd done enough educating, right? I think everyone can admit you're done educating when you've gotten your PhD. I wanted to go and get a job, like go do something with my degree. And teaching, becoming an academic or a researcher, when you grew up in the projects, that's not the way your mom treats you. That's not the way your teachers, they want you to go and do something. Especially you're that young, you have no business teaching, right? Because you don't have an experience to teach. So I really wanted to go and get a job in a company as a political scientist. And what I learned, and I had not appreciated when I started my PhD, is that companies didn't hire political scientists. So I started the company with this after a year of getting frustrated that no one was hiring me to be a political scientist, even though they were very nice to me and they said, well, you're really interesting what you do. We kind of like it. I said, well, look, if I started my own thing, since this job doesn't exist, would you become a client? And a whole bunch of people said, sure. They weren't throwing that much money at me and it was just me, so who cared? But, you add that up and you work hard enough and eventually you got a company. And the funny thing is 24 years on, I'll tell you a funny thing. So just yesterday, the head of Rockefeller Asset Management, who has wanted to work with us for a while, sends a note to one of my guys and says, yeah, we really do want to work with you, but we'd like to invest. We'd like to become a shareholder in Eurasia Group. And she writes back, I didn't even hear about this. She writes back and she's like, well, there's only been one shareholder for 24 years, so that's not going to happen. But we'd love to have you as a client. And literally the CEO writes me with a smiley face, like, okay, I get it. But it amused me because it brought me back to Kid from the Projects. And if you had told me that, in 2022, that the head of Rockefeller is going to be writing saying we'd like to be a shareholder, and I was like, no, that's not going to happen. That would have been an implausible story when I was growing up. So, it's kind of amusing.
That's amazing. I had no idea what your background was. I didn't know that you went to college at 15. I didn't know you grew up in such economic circumstances. And just hearing you
It's
talk
great.
about
That
your
means that you find me emotionally much more balanced than people would have said when I was younger. I appreciate that.
yeah, so that I feel like that deserves a whole nother episode. And I know that we don't have the time for it today, so maybe another time, as much as I want to actually follow that thread. So let's kind of bring it back to your book, because I also mentioned we talked about the 1990s just now. You did. I mentioned the 2000s. Those are certainly somewhat relevant to this conversation. I'm sure we'll touch on them. But let's talk about the power of crisis. What is the thesis that you lay out in the book? And what are the three crises that you believe that we're facing today? And how did you come to choose those? And why do you feel that the story that you have to tell in this book is important?
The thesis is that the new global order, the next global order, will be created in large part from seeds that are sown out of these crises. We've watched over the last 20 years as our institutions, both domestically and internationally, have eroded. They've become delegitimized, they've become more polarized, they've become more broken. And I've written about that. I wrote about that in The End of the Free Market, on the economic fight of the two different US and Chinese economic systems. I wrote about it with Every Nation for Itself when I coined the term a G0 world, with the absence of global leadership in a G7 and G20. I wrote about it with Us versus Them, the failure of globalism, when I talked about the anti-establishment trends inside democracies all over the world, not just our own. And I have to tell you, as someone who is an existential optimist, I was getting kind of bummed that my books were all writing about this descent into what is essentially a long cycle geopolitical recession. It's when the balance of power and is no longer aligned with your institutions and your architecture. When that happens, you get a lot of crises. And this book is a hopeful book, a much more hopeful book. And it looks at the crises as opportunities that we will make at least some use of, and maybe a lot of use of, to either reform our institutions or create new institutions that will be much more viable and vital for the 21st century. And the crises I look at, kind of three and a half, if you will, one being the pandemic, a truly global crisis, the biggest many of us have lived through in our lives, that has gone through for 2.5 years now, and we're still living it, some far more than others. But it's nice that we're kind of coming out of it, because it gives us a little bit of perspective on lessons we have and haven't learned. Second, climate change, which is the obvious global crisis that is in front of all of us, that has been growing for decades now and is looming as, sort of the biggest global crisis presently on the agenda of every major leader in the world, whether private or public sector. Third, the existential crisis that isn't yet in front of most of us, but should be, which is the crisis of the proliferation of disruptive technologies. When I was growing up, that was the most existential crisis in terms of nuclear weapons. And the Americans and Soviets did a lot of work to try to ensure that we wouldn't blow each other up, even though we had some near misses. But we're not doing that today, and we need to fast. And then, of course, I had to put the book to bed on the 26th of February. And on the 24th of February, the Russians invaded Ukraine. And that invasion not only is a topic that is very close to my heart and my personal expertise, but also the topic is completely on point for the book, because it's yet another sudden major global crisis that clearly creates opportunities to build institutions and rebuild institutions that were eroding dramatically over the course of the last couple of decades, and in some ways, how you started the podcast with me.
So let's actually go there to Ukraine, because that kind of touches on one of the three crises, which is climate, not directly, but indirectly through energy.
Sure.
And our climate policies. So where are we in this war right now? And what is the next unstable equilibrium that leaders involved in this conflict, including the US and European countries and NATO member countries, are looking to reach if we assume that the invasion on the 24th set things into a state of disequilibria from a previously unstable equilibrium?
So there are two different wars going on. There's the war between Russia and Ukraine, and then there's the war between Russia and NATO. Thankfully, the Russia-NATO war is not a hot war, even though it will probably develop some elements of a hot war in relatively short order. They are obviously very connected. They were set into motion on the same date, but they are different. The Russia-Ukraine war is a war that is being fought between massive unequals. And Russia's military is 10x the expenditure of Ukraine's. This year, that gap has been closed dramatically by the extraordinary international support that's been provided to Ukraine, led by the United States, but also by the Europeans. It is hard to imagine that level of support persisting. Ukraine matters immensely more to Russia than it does to NATO. That will remain true going forward. And so as much as the Ukrainians have been this extraordinarily courageous nation that is fighting for survival and was able to beat the Russians out of the suburbs of Kyiv and out of the environs of Kharkiv, which is the second largest city. I mean, really, the first 2-3 months of the war was a David versus Goliath story, and Goliath was going down. But no one would argue credibly that that's going to continue. And the Russians are now taking much more territory in the Donbass. They've refocused. The Ukrainians are begging for support. They're getting a lot. It's not enough. And the Russians will have more territory. They will continue to occupy it. They will almost certainly annex it. And they will declare a win, which from the perspective of the Russian people is something that will seem plausible, at least in the near term. So we can make this argument that the Russians are, quote unquote, winning versus Ukraine compared to where they were on February 23rd. That is an unacceptable outcome. And of course, the level of trauma that 44 million Ukrainians are going through is impossible to overestimate. Now, if that were the only story going on, this would be a very, very depressing conversation. It's still a depressing conversation because we're talking about war. But I want to be clear that the Russians are they're not winning the war versus NATO. They are losing the war versus NATO, and they're losing badly. And that will persist.
How do we measure that? And how are you measuring
in
that?
Every way? Russia, before they invaded Ukraine, Putin said that the main issue was the NATO expansion and enlargement, which was unacceptable. Well, I mean, NATO had been adrift for decades, and Obama and Trump and Biden tried to get the Europeans to pay more attention. They failed. Putin succeeded. And NATO is now enlarging, it's expanding, including right on Russia's borders with Finland and Sweden about to join NATO. The amount of money that's being spent on NATO, massively more. The Germans finally are going to 2% of defense spend, forward deployments, permanent basing in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Bulgaria, in Romania. In addition to this, the level of support for Ukraine, which is not, saving the tens of thousands of Ukrainians that have been killed. It's not getting back the territory. But Ukraine is about to be invited into the EU as a candidate member. So Europe is basically saying, you know what? Maybe we weren't at war with Russia. We're about to be at war with Russia. Why? Because we're bringing Ukraine in and they're at war with Russia. That's a big deal. That makes this permanent, right? And it makes it an EU issue going forward forever. And people don't seem to recognize that. And then, of course, on top of that, we have a greater level of sanction than the world has ever put on a G20 country, ever. The freezing of the central bank assets, way beyond what anyone thought the West would do. And by the way, in the same way that Russia ends up in a stronger position vis-a-vis Ukraine over time, they end up in a weaker position vis-a-vis NATO over time, not only because the Russian economy is going to get devastated, it's going to shrink by 10 to 15% this year. That is a Greece-style depression in scale. And it's not over after this year, just getting started. But, the Europeans are becoming less dependent on Russia. And every bit of diversification makes it easier for them to tell the Russians to go screw themselves. And this is the case first with coal, and then with oil, and then with gas. and with multinationals that are pulling out. So, I mean, the level of misjudgment that Putin made in terms of the expected Western response to his invasion is of a greater scale than that of any major leader on the global stage since the wall came down in '89. It is staggering how badly Putin has screwed this up. It's really quite something.
So you touched on so many points there. Let's try to unpack them. Let's first start with sanctions, and specifically the sanctions against the oil and gas industry, because I'm not exactly clear on where Europe is at this moment. From what I last read, the goal is to basically, with the exception of a few countries, completely shut down the imports of Russian oil by the end of 2023. Now, what they plan to do with gas, I don't know.
Take longer.
Okay, because gas in particular, I mean, I would love for you to kind of unpack this for me. Germany, let's take Germany. Germany is heavily reliant on Russian gas to operate not just consumer needs, but also its industrial base.
BASF is out of business if Russian gas is cut off right now. That's right.
All right, so
they're the most dependent, by the way, but yes, yeah.
Okay, so how do we realistically, let's say this Western alliance of the United States and Europe, how do we realistically confront, and this is such a complicated question because now it also speaks to the larger strategic vision of the United States and the fact that that's also somewhat unclear and still coming together. So as all of these things are still kind of in this gaseous state of still coming together, and Europe is highly dependent on Russian imports of oil and gas, but particularly gas, how does this whole transition happen? And how does U.S. policy have to change? And how does climate policy perhaps, maybe not climate policy, but energy policy around climate have to change or adjust in order to accommodate for the geostrategic realities that this ongoing war represents and the fact that that dependency on Russian oil and gas represents a national security risk for the Europeans?
Look, I want to make clear this is an absolute top priority for almost every European leader right now, which means they are doing everything they can to respond to your question. It is not easy because it's very important because they decided this wasn't a problem for them for decades. And so they just got very, very dependent on cheap and easily located Russian energy. And now they're kind of stuck. And frankly, the speed with which they've been able to transition already has been far greater than anyone would have expected before the war started. Again, because it's such a priority. What are they doing? They're doing everything. They're throwing everything at this issue. So they're focusing on efficiency. They're trying to actually, reduce waste in the system. They're prioritizing that in a way that they've never done before. They are trying to step up renewables. And the Europeans were focusing high on renewables. They're focusing more on it. They're spending more. They're trying to expand. On hydrogen too. I mean, lots of things that they're trying to do. Third, they're diversifying. They're focusing more on securing alternative, particularly gas flows into Europe from Qatar, from Azerbaijan, LNG from the United States. They're building out new infrastructure, new LNG terminals. They're building them as quickly as possible. They are also restarting coal, which is, that's a dirty industry, but they're still doing it because, what happens if they suddenly lose their gas? They're stockpiling for the winter. They're doing everything. And part of the reason they're doing everything is because if you're Russia and you know that the Europeans are intending to completely cut you off in 2 or 3 years, why would you wait for them to do it on their terms when prices have probably gone down? And the Russians know that. And that's precisely why the Russians have said that there are technical problems with Nord Stream 1 and suddenly are taking significant gas flows out of the market right now in advance before it needs to be done by the Europeans. They want more leverage and are willing to sacrifice some cash to get more leverage, to induce more pain. They're trying to drive a wedge inside the EU or inside the transatlantic relationship. And again, they're failing. The story here is Ukraine taking it in the teeth, and NATO coming together like we've never seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's the story. That's the consistent story. And you're going to see it play out at the G7 and NATO summit in the coming week. You're going to see it continue. You saw it last week with the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Romanians visiting Kiev, and then Boris Johnson the next day. You will continue to see it. That's the story. That's the story.
All right. So a bunch of things. One, just to take the last point, and I'd love for you to address it. What is the likelihood that Europe's attitude towards this war and towards the Russian menace, the Russian threat to its east, becomes another object of complacency, like so many other things? Or do they end up showing resolve because of the nature of the threat and the fact that the invasion of Ukraine really was something that changed the game in Europe?
That's a much bigger risk for the United States than it is for Europe. I'm honestly...
What is a bigger risk?
Complacency. Complacency.
Got it.
Yeah, look,
Sure.
First of all, it's right there, right? Ukraine is right there. There are millions of refugees in European homes, in their communities. They're seeing it every day. It's real to them. And they don't think of them as other the way they did with Syrians or even, Turks, frankly. And look, that says something somewhat ugly about humanity, but it doesn't mean that we can't address it. We have to address it. I go back to the point I made a few moments ago. They're going to bring the Ukraine candidate membership status to the EU. What does that mean? That means a candidate member of the EU they're bringing in is at war with Russia. They are making this a bigger deal, not a smaller deal. And the importance of Russia over time to Europe goes down. So they don't have the same leverage. So accept that there will be anger at inflation. Accept that there will be anger at the danger that comes from continuing to support Ukraine. And there are some countries like Hungary, which is in the EU, and Serbia, which is not, that are outliers. But this is going to be a long-term European fight. There's no question in my mind. And I think that the decoupling of the Russian economy from the advanced industrial economies is functionally permanent. In part because I don't believe there'll be a negotiated breakthrough that works on Ukraine. But what I'm convinced of is if there isn't, you're not going to see a climb down from the Americans and the Europeans say, well, I guess we got to work with them. I mean, you remember, we used to sanction heavily India and Pakistan when they developed nuclear weapons. And then over time, we were like, well, that kind of didn't work. So now we should start working with India and Pakistan again. I don't think that is going to happen if the Russians are occupying Ukraine.
All right, so let's talk more specifically about what it would take to make that happen. Now, I've read analyses, and I think this was also the position of Jeff Curry, who came on the show to talk about commodities, which is that it's very difficult to run a modern industrial economy off of LNG imports. And the Germans really don't have any other clean option. Like you said, they're using coal. It's not clear where they are on nuclear. From what I've read, it sounds like maybe the mood is starting to change.
It is.
In Germany. So let's just focus on that right now, which is how do you see energy policy changing, speeding up in order to accommodate for this situation and in order to give the Europeans the leverage that they need? Because another question I have, and please just roll this into your answer, who's got more leverage in this situation right now, as it stands today, with the energy needs of Europe and the needs by the Russians to, build their war chest with income?
Right now, I think the leverage is shared. I think it's shifting. Every day that goes, the Russians have a little bit less leverage. There's seasonality to that, so it's less in the summer. It'll be more in the winter. But again, over time, you're going to see that the Europeans have a lot more leverage. The Germans, depending on who you talk to, say that they can be completely free of Russian gas within 2 to 3 years, and that they can be at least 50% free of Russian gas compared to where they were a year ago by this winter. And that's a big deal. Now, are the Germans much more capable of acting as a community and taking on board rationing and shortages? If they have to, I would argue, yes, they probably are, given the nature of this crisis. But how much? How much will they take? How deep will that run? How willing are they to be a little colder in the wintertime to help their economy go forward in a robust way? We may test that proposition. So there's no question that come next winter, the Russians will have some meaningful leverage over the German population and therefore over the German government. But I would not underestimate the anger here. And these are not poor countries. These are rich countries. And if these are rich countries that have to, if Germany has to experience a mild recession as a consequence of their transition away from Russian energy, which they all admit was a mistake. Merkel, a mistake. Trump was saying it, right? I mean, Obama was saying it. None of these presidents were happy with the fact that the Germans were going ahead with Nord Stream 2. We're just, embracing the Russian bear for energy transition. They now all understand it was a mistake. They're going to have to pay for that. Paying for that doesn't mean that you suddenly say, okay, I guess we'll just stick with Russia. No, they truly want out. And so the obvious answer is that means there's more significant downside risk for German economic growth in the next 2 to 3 years than there is in the United States. Of course it means that. It means that inflation today in Germany is higher because of energy prices and concerns about higher energy prices. In the United States, the mix is more about fiscal policy. In the UK, it's more about their currency and Brexit concerns. So it's just different in different places. That's again, that shouldn't surprise anybody.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about oil for a second, because right now we've got rolling lockouts in China. I don't know exactly where we are there at this moment, exactly like what the situation is, but they've been dealing with some form of lockdown in 2022 as a result of COVID. We have what some analysts have called unprecedented amounts of oil that are being released from the U.S. Strategic Reserve.
Yeah, what's in 1 million barrels a day or something like that?
I'm not sure exactly what it is, but that was the way that I saw it described.
Yeah.
And it's significant to determine how much it is, certainly, but the release of oil as a general fact puts downward pressure on prices. There's talk about a gas tax holiday, which would actually put upward pressure on oil prices globally. And then you've got the other thing that we didn't have a chance to discuss, which is the conversations that I've heard around basically making it so that European and I guess also U.S. companies would no longer be able to insure Russian cargo or Russian oil shipments. So like all of these things create a lot of uncertainty around oil prices. And that uncertainty has a direct impact, of course, on the viability of, or the staying power, again, to bring it back to the Europeans, to the staying power. And then that speaks directly to what we were talking about when we started, which was climate policy and the immediate energy needs of these countries and how are they going to bridge that gap. So I mentioned nuclear. I've heard conversations that the German people, the German political system is warming up to the idea. What are the important changes that you expect us to see with respect to the energy transition as a result of what's happening? And also embedded in that question is, what do you think is going to happen to oil prices, if you have any view on it one way or the other?
Yeah, well, too many questions, to be honest. So it's hard to focus. I would say that there's a big difference between the long term and the short term. And the Europeans were way ahead of any other part of the planet in terms of their transition to renewables. And that continues to be true. That obviously helps them in the same way that dependence on Russia hurts them. And yes, restarting coal and needing to find alternative sources of oil and gas, none of that is clean. And all of that implies that in the near term, emission loads coming out of Europe are going to go up farther than they want. But at the same time, we talk about efficiency. Those investments, once you make them, stick. And you also talk about pushing faster renewables. And that's the most important commitment the EU can make for the long term. So if the Russian disruption is a 3-year disruption for most of the Europeans and slightly more than that for a couple East Europeans that are a small percentage of the total, then actually the Russian invasion of Ukraine ends up long term moving the Europeans faster towards a renewable transition, a net zero transition. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Okay, leave that question aside. To address the nearer term oil issue, oil prices right now are higher, in my view, than they should be. Certainly on the basis of the fundamentals, because the major change in fundamentals so far this year has been demand destruction. It's been zero COVID policies and far less growth in China than you were expecting at the beginning of the year. And on top of that, concerns of recession in the United States and Europe that are also causing some demand destruction. Probably 1 million barrels a day on average for the course of the year is, I think, what a reasonable estimate would be. Then on top of that, you already mentioned the Strategic Petroleum Reserve release, which is historically unprecedented. I think that's another 1 million barrels. Now, why are prices so damn high? Because they were 70 before the Russian invasion, and people thought that you were going to have more supply than you needed. So actually, there was a bearish tendency in that price over the course of the year. Suddenly, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, everything changes. Now, we're missing some oil from Libya. The conflict there, it's 1 million. We're not getting an Iran deal, but that was probably priced in. The OPEC has relatively limited excess capacity. About 1.5 million barrels per day is the general assessment, which is historically low. That matters. And then you've got bigger concerns than normal about hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. But that's been like structurally true over some time. None of that would get you to 120. None of that would get you Goldman saying 140, Trafigura saying 150. And yet that's where we are. And I think the reason for that is because of an extraordinary concern that the Europeans are going to implement a full shipping boycott. Shipping services, insurance, and reinsurance, which is 90% of what gets Russian oil out. And by the way, I think one thing that I'm going to tell you right now that I think will shock you, Russian exports of oil today are actually at the same level they were when the war started. They went down about 1 million barrels a day the first month too. They're back up because other countries are buying and because the shipping stuff hasn't hit. Now, if the shipping stuff were to hit 100%, I understand where we are. But I think that's wrong. I think the Europeans are slow rolling it. And I think they're also trying to find a way that this doesn't fundamentally just hit the Europeans. They want to find waivers that will, with tariffs that will allow the Europeans to functionally pay the same price for Russian crude, discounted significantly, that during their transition away from Russian crude, which they're doing as fast as they can, as the Indians and the Chinese. And if that's true, then prices shouldn't be close to 120 right now. And they sure as hell aren't going up to 140, 150. And I think that piece of information I just gave you is not understood yet. And I think it will be over the coming month or two.
So do you think that that currently the level of investment in the oil and gas space, and especially in the U.S., is enough to make this transition to more sustainable fuels feasible?
Don't know. I mean, because we're in a geopolitical environment that is going to have a lot more instability. So in tail risk environments, the answer to that is probably the stresses are going to be higher. Look, in the same way that when you have the pandemic and everyone is running just-in-time supply chains, those supply chains are very vulnerable and fragile because you didn't want to invest in resilience. Well, the global energy market is kind of no different. Like if you don't have a whole bunch of spare capacity just sitting around and suddenly something breaks, then prices are going to go higher because you didn't feel like paying for all that insurance over the course of the flush times. And I think that's still true.
So, for example, rather than implement a gas holiday tax, for example, should the Biden administration be figuring out how to work with the private sector in order to offset some of the risks and the costs of actually investing in an industry that government policy and also some commercial policies is trying to phase out in an unnaturally early period of time so that those investments wouldn't actually pan out if you didn't have government support? I mean, is there a role for policy to change here?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, but the question you're asking has to do with values and discount factors more than it has to do with, like, is it a good idea, right? I mean, there are legitimate arguments on both sides there. Like, if you actually believe that your high value is, no, we have really underinvested in the transition, and we've all benefited from that in terms of economic growth and profit taking for the last decades, and we now need to pay that. We need more of a tax that's going to force us more quickly to get to where the Europeans are in a transition. And in fact, we need to be the energy superpower on renewable fuels. So we need to be better than the Chinese, because we don't want the Chinese dominating that supply chain. We don't want the Chinese dominating solar and wind and EVs and supply chain. We want to do that. And we're not going to do that if we put more money into fossil fuels now. So we need to take that pain. And if that's consumer pain, we need to provide, yes, some subsidies for them, make it cheaper for the poorest. But for everybody else, we should have gas prices that are actually closer to what the Europeans are presently paying. That's a legitimate argument, right? Now, that's not a legitimate argument that's going to win you many votes in places that are fossil fuel flush in the United States. It's easy to make that argument when you're not actually producing fossil fuels like the Europeans. By the way, it's easier to make arguments that support privacy and data controls for citizens that are clearly more safe for your kids when you don't have tech companies like the Europeans. So, these are legitimate trade-offs. The Americans have decided that we want more growth and we want more animal spirits and we want corporations to have relatively lower tax load and more capacity to grow. We want more Elon Musks and Jeff Bezoses, and we don't mind if there's a lot more economic inequality in the United States. That's a choice. That's a place you get to fall along the curve. And, whether or not that ends up being a good bet long term depends on, kind of what your priorities and your values are as a human being.
So that speaks directly to the domestic political trade-offs. But what about the international trade-offs? And I'm thinking specifically of developing or lower income countries that are going to be competing with, for example, Germany is driving up the price of coal right now.
Yeah.
So how does having an energy policy that drives up the cost of energy for developing countries impact the U.S.'s ability to actually both lead this climate transition most efficiently, but also manage the geopolitical dynamics of actually losing clout and leadership clout in those parts of the world?
So two separate questions. One is leading the climate transition because the Americans want to be the superpower in post-carbon energy. And that means investing like hell in having control over those companies, those technologies, that supply chain. And then secondly, leading the climate transition in trying to help the world get to 1.5 centigrade as opposed to 2.5. Most Americans in power are at least nominally interested in the former. Very few are actually interested in the latter. They might say it, but they don't care. And because the latter requires a green Marshall Plan, which I write about in my book. Look, the difference between 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2.5 degrees centigrade warming is a difference of hundreds of trillions of dollars in global value and hundreds of millions of actual lives of human beings. So, if you care about that globally, if you care about that long term, then obviously you would want to spend an enormous amount to create a policy set that will bring you to 1.5. Now, let me tell you, I have a really easy way that will get us to 1.5 as opposed to 2.5. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
We need to believe that Indians are human beings. It's all we need to do, but we don't. And that's a problem.
You're saying that we need to see Indians as being the same as us.
Yeah.
As not, in other words, seeing it as a problem that's outside of our radar.
That's right. That's all we need to do. Now, it's not going to happen. There's no way we're going to do that. Now, for me, honestly, Dimitri, this is where I have the single biggest problem with America's political spectrum, our view of American exceptionalism. Because I consider myself a patriot. I really do. I love my country. I'm so fortunate I was born here. It is so obvious that it's given me every opportunity. But I am not a nationalist at all. I do not believe that America is somehow fundamentally better, that Americans are fundamentally better as human beings than other countries. And in that regard, I am fundamentally different than people that run our country. I just am. And I think that's a huge problem because I wish that we had a different immigration policy. Why? Because we can, because we're wealthy, because my grandma had the opportunity, and I don't know why we wouldn't give other people. It feels like an obligation. They're human beings. I don't understand why we spend so little on foreign aid. I don't get it. I don't get why we couldn't do more to get vaccines to poorer countries when we weren't even willing to take boosters that we already had in our country. I don't understand that level of risk aversion, not just from Trump, but from Biden. I don't get it. I don't get it. It feels inhuman to me. Like literally it feels inhuman. And so, given that we don't think that Indians are human beings, we say it, but it's performative. We don't act that way. It's kind of thinking that, like, we care about blacks. When the crack cocaine issue hit, we didn't act like we cared about blacks. We don't. Or gun violence in the United States when it's overwhelmingly, sort of black on black. And so we don't care. We don't do anything about it. That tells you who you are. It tells you what your values are. And our values on climate change are that we don't care about poor people outside of the United States in particular. If they can't afford to develop, they don't get to develop. We're not going to pay for their transition, which means that they are going to emit coal into the atmosphere, knowing what damage it will do, just as we emitted all the coal in the atmosphere that got us to this point, first not knowing what it will do, and then knowing what it will do. They're so much poorer than we are. Why wouldn't they do that? So, it really is that simple. This is the part of my book that I find most personally frustrating because it seems so obvious.
So many aspects of that to address, Ian, that again.
I want to understand if you actually agree with that. Are you sympathetic to that argument?
Here's what I was going to say. Number one, I think I forget the name of this actual thought experiment, but it has to do with when you see someone drowning in front of you versus someone says you can save so many people in theory in your head. And that's an operational issue. Number one. There's also dysfunction because I think part of this also speaks to that. It isn't necessarily an issue of values.
Yep.
This is like the most wicked set of problems I can think of. You're talking about a nonlinear system with long-term impacts that you don't see right now, but actions today impact those things. You also have an educational gap, which can only be filled through trust because the vast majority of people ultimately have to trust the science. They have to trust what their leaders are saying. And fundamentally, America is at a place of less trust in institutions than any point in my memory, which I think actually, and this is something else I wanted to ask you about, and I'm not even going to try to we're going to transition to the second part here, but it seems to me that the big divide in America today is not ideological.
Yep.
It isn't that there's some ideology that Republicans have and some coherent ideology that Democrats have, and they're divided over that. I think that one of the fundamental dividing lines is really about trust in institutions of power versus distrust. And that creates this political sclerosis. And my point about energy is important. It isn't because I think that the transition isn't important and that the things that you've laid out aren't very important, but it's exactly because of the facts of politics, facts of the human animal that worries me if we don't have the ability to manage this transition in such a way that the populations of Europe and the United States will simply rebel against it. And that, let's say, a country like Russia and China will be able to exercise leverage over the U.S. because we don't have the ability to make this transition without prices getting so out of control that people are going to freak out. That, to me, is something that I've started to really appreciate more as a result of the invasion and what we've been seeing. That's what I was trying to kind of get at with my questions. But we're going to move those over into the second part of the conversation, Ian. And if we'll have a chance, maybe we can also talk about Turkey, because I think that's a huge thing. It kind of falls outside of this. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second part of today's conversation with Ian, as well as the episode transcripts and intelligence reports, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library, where you can also become a premium subscriber today. Ian, stick around. We're going to move the second part of our conversation onto the premium feed. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to full episodes, transcripts, and intelligence reports, which include additional notes, resources, links, and other material that will help you get the most out of each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website at hiddenforces.io. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.